Before getting down to the details of how to use PHP, let's take a look at how it makes web pages dynamic and how it differs from JavaScript. When someone visits a website, the browser sends a request to the web server, which responds by sending back the HTML, images, style sheet, and other resources for the browser to display. If the page contains interactive features such as an accordion or tab panels, the JavaScript that controls them is sent along at the same time, either in a separate JavaScript file or embedded in the HTML. This HTML page contains an accordion widget. As long as the page remains open in the browser, the JavaScript sits patiently listening for click events. As soon as I click on the heading of a panel, the JavaScript springs into action, sliding the panels open and closed. Like JavaScript, PHP can be in a separate file. Don't worry what the code means at the moment, it'll become clear as you progress through the course. PHP code can also be embedded in the HTML, as it is on line 12 in this page, but that's where the similarity ends. When a browser requests a PHP page, the web server sends the page to the PHP engine, a piece of software that runs on the server. This processes the PHP code and merges the output with the HTML, and it's this merged output that's sent back to the browser. The PHP code remains on the server and is never seen by the browser or by the person requesting the page. Let's load this PHP page into a browser by running it through my testing server. So I'll open a browser, add a new tab, and the address will be localhost/exercises/chapter01/01_01 and then PHP time, the name of the file, .php. The PHP engine processes the PHP code embedded in the HTML, gets the current time from the server and displays it. It also includes the external file, copyright PHP, which generates the range of years for the copyright notice. And if I view the page source, let's just right-click and view page source, you can see here there's no sign of the PHP code. The time and the date range are simply part of the HTML. And this is a fundamental difference between the dynamic output created by PHP and JavaScript. Although JavaScript can send a request to the server to load fresh content, most of the time it runs entirely in the browser. The difference becomes obvious if we look at this page. If I scroll down to the bottom of the page, this JavaScript here generates the current time and updates it every second. I don't even need to run it through my testing server. I can just open it directly in a browser and the JavaScript goes to work. So if I open my files and then double-click jstime.html, it opens in the browser and it's running the time, and the time is constantly being updated. The JavaScript also listens for click events on these two buttons down here. So I can stop the clock, and then if I click Start Clock, it starts it again, updating the time with the new time. You can't do that with PHP. Once the server has generated the output, that's it. That time is fixed. The only way to update the time with PHP is to send another request to the server, for example, by reloading the page. I've now got the new time, but it won't change until I reload the page again. PHP stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. The name's a bit of a mouthful, but it simply means that the code is processed on the web server rather than in the browser. That doesn't mean PHP is less powerful than JavaScript, far from it. One area where PHP comes in extremely useful is in its ability to process input from online forms. If I enter my name in this form, just type my name in there, David, and then submit it, the page displays a suitable greeting according to the time of the day. Admittedly, you could do something similar with JavaScript, but let's just look at the source code in the browser. Although the URL is still the same, the content of the page has changed completely. The form is no longer there. This is only a trivial example, but it has enormous implications. Using PHP, you can serve different content to people depending on who they are or if they're logged in. Another major strength of PHP is its ability to query a database. The PHP engine hands off the query to the database and populates the HTML with the results, usually in a fraction of a second, ready for the server to send back to the browser. You'll learn how to do that towards the end of this course. But before we get there, you need to learn some of the basics of how to incorporate PHP code into your web pages. The web server needs to process any PHP code before it sends the page to the browser, but it won't do that unless you tell it to do so. You do that by giving your web pages the file name extension .php instead of .htm or .html. Let's create a simple page. I'm in Dreamweaver, and in the welcome screen there's actually an option for create a PHP page. If I click that, you'll see that I get an ordinary web page complete with doc type and an HTML skeleton. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this page in my exercises folder as embed and then .php. That PHP file name extension is simply an instruction to the server. It doesn't make any difference to the way you build the HTML structure or the CSS in your web pages. So let's add some HTML and some PHP to this page. First we need to give it a title, so change that untitled document to embedding PHP in HTML. Then in the body of the page, let's have a top level heading, an H1, and we'll just say this is plain HTML, and a paragraph. So is this. And our third paragraph, this is HTML, but the day is generated by PHP. And then comes the PHP part. And what we're going to do is we need to have an opening PHP tag, which is an open angle bracket, a question mark, then PHP, no space between them, and a space after the PHP. And I'm going to put a little bit of PHP code in here. Echo, which will display something, and then use the PHP date function and give it an argument of L, lowercase l in quotes, then a semicolon, and I need a closing PHP tag, which is a question mark and an angle bracket. Then we'll add a period, which will be part of the HTML, and the closing P tag. I'm just going to save that page, Control S or Command S in your editor. And then let's go into our browser and see the result. And so I need to open a new tab, and the address will be localhost/ch01/01_02/ and then the name of the file, which was embed.php. And there it is. There is my web page. This is plain HTML. This is HTML. But this bit is generated by PHP. My day, Monday, I'm recording on a Monday, has been generated by the PHP code. So if I go back to my editor, it's this PHP block on line 11 that has been converted into the current day of the week. And if you test this yourself, of course, the day of the week will depend on whichever day that you're using it. Sometimes PHP is stored in a separate file. I've got an example here in the 01_02 folder called copyright.php. Let me just open that. And this contains only PHP. Notice that there's a PHP opening tag at the beginning and a closing tag at the end. And it's very important to make sure that there is no space before the opening tag or no space or extra lines after the closing tag. If you put extra space in, it can create a problem known as headers already sent. I deal with that particular problem in the chapter on handling PHP errors, and you'll see how to deal with it later in this course. Now, the important thing to remember is that when you give a page a .php file name extension, you always need to view it through a web browser, even if it doesn't contain any PHP code. When building sites that use PHP, store your files inside the root folder of your testing server. This is the equivalent of the top level of a website. If you're using XAMPP on Windows or MAMP on a Mac, the root folder is called htdocs. WAMP Server and EasyPHP use a folder called www, and Microsoft's IIS uses a folder called www.root. To view a PHP page, make sure the web server in your testing environment is running. To display the file, enter the URL in the browser address bar. If you're using the server's root folder in a local testing environment, the URL is http://localhost, followed by the location of the file. Separate folder names by forward slashes and finish off with the file name. If you're using a non-standard port, add the port number preceded by a colon after localhost. For example, by default, MAMP uses http://localhost:8888. Throughout this course, I assume you're using the server root of a local testing server. If you set up a virtual host or are using your remote server for testing, you'll need to adjust the URL accordingly. Although it's possible to configure a server to process PHP with a different file name extension, you should normally use .php. Use this for all files in a site, even if you don't plan to add PHP code to a particular file. There's nothing to stop you from mixing .html and .php file name extensions in the same site, but resist the temptation to convert only some files when adapting an existing site. It leads to confusion and broken links. Always wrap PHP code in PHP tags. An opening tag consists of an opening angle bracket, a question mark, and the letters PHP. You might see code examples that omit the letters from the opening tag, but short opening tags don't work on all servers, so stick with this format. The closing tag is a question mark followed by a closing angle bracket. One final point, you can have as many blocks of PHP code as you like in a page, but each block must be independent. You can't nest PHP tags inside each other. One of the most important features of a programming language like PHP is the use of variables to store values that might change or aren't known in advance. If you've done any work with JavaScript, much of this will be familiar to you, but there are some important differences. Even if you don't know any other programming language, you use variables all the time without even realizing it. For example, what's your name? My name's David, but my producer's name is Scott. The word name is a real-life variable. Name always remains the same, but its value changes. Let's look at some other real-life examples of variables. What day is it? What's the distance? Which city are you going to? To convert these real-life variables into PHP variables, just stick a $sign at the beginning of the word. A PHP script can then change the value of the variable. Depending on who's logged into a website, name might become David, Scott, or Linda. PHP is capable of working out the current day or date, so day might become Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on. Using a database and input from a form, distance might be displayed as 380 miles if the city selected is San Francisco. But if the city changes to Santa Barbara, distance changes to 95 miles. When creating variables, you can choose any name you want, but descriptive names like those I've used here make your code much easier to understand. There are just a few simple rules governing the names of variables in PHP. A variable must always begin with a $sign. Use only numbers, letters, and the underscore. In other words, no spaces are allowed. So if you want a variable to be made up of multiple words, use a capital letter for the second and any subsequent words. This is often called camel case. Alternatively, use an underscore to join the words. The underscore is the only punctuation allowed. You can't use a hyphen instead. Neither can you use a number as the first character after the $sign. It's also important to realize that variables are case sensitive. A variable called name that begins with a lowercase n is not the same as name with a capital N. Spelling a variable with the wrong combination of uppercase and lowercase is one of the most common mistakes in PHP. One last rule. Although you can call variables just about anything you want, there's one exception. This is a reserved word. Variables in PHP can store all sorts of values, bringing flexibility to your scripts. In the next two videos, I'll show you how to store text and numbers in variables and then display their values in a web page. PHP variables can store many different types of information. For the time being, let's just focus on how you store numbers and text in a variable. We'll also look at the important role the semicolon plays in PHP. This page, variables.php, contains a simple template for a web page about a book. I'm going to add my PHP code above the doc type. So if I put my insertion point up there, add in a couple of extra lines, then an opening PHP tag, open angle bracket, question mark, PHP, then down here a closing tag, which is a question mark, and a closing angle bracket. It might seem strange to you that I'm putting the PHP code above the doc type, but remember, PHP code is processed by the server, and that's where it stays. So as long as the PHP code doesn't output any HTML, it's okay above the doc type. That will remain at the top of the page when it's received by the browser. So let's add our first variable. This one will be a number. We'll call it answer. Variables always begin with a $sign, so $answer. Then an equals sign. Numbers don't need to be in quotes, so just 42 and then a semicolon. You can also have decimal points in numbers, so let's have another variable for price, $sign, price, and then equals 10.99 and a semicolon. Now, if you've been used to working with JavaScript, you might say, oh, why do I need a semicolon at the end every time? Well, let's see what happens if I remove the semicolon after that 42. I'll save the page, go to my browser, and it's 01_04, and the name of the page was variables.php, and I've got this awful error message. There's a special chapter at the end of this course that deals with error messages, what they mean, and how to get rid of the problem. All we need to know in this particular case is that what has happened is I've left out that semicolon. Semicolons might be optional in JavaScript, but they're not optional in PHP. Let's go back to my editor. PHP is written in a series of commands, and the only way that PHP knows that the command has come to an end is with that semicolon. If I add it back in, save the page, and reload the page in the browser, it now displays correctly. It's not displaying the content of the variable because I haven't added that code yet, but the page is now displaying correctly, and that's the important thing. So let's add some more. This time we're going to add some text, and in common with other programming languages, PHP calls text strings. It's a piece of technical jargon that you'll hear over and over again. So let's add a variable. We'll call this one title, equals sign, and strings or text need to be in matching quotes. You can use single quotes or double quotes. The recommended practice is to use single quotes wherever practicable. So let's try that. Single quote, and the title I'm going to use is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Because I'm using Dreamweaver, which has got live syntax checking, it tells me that there's an error on line 4. That's this red mark here. And the problem is that I've got an apostrophe in the middle of my string. And what happens is that PHP regards that apostrophe as being the closing matching quote. One way to get around this is to put a backslash in front of an apostrophe. And the syntax warning has gone away. So that does fix it, but it looks rather ugly and it's difficult to read. So that's the point about wherever practical, use single quotes. It's not really practical here, so let's change it to double quotes. And the syntax warnings have gone away. Let's add another variable. This one will be for author, always beginning, of course, with that $sign, and the author is Douglas Adams. And one final variable, this will be a description, and this time I'm going to spread it over several lines, and it won't be until we get to that semicolon that PHP will know that the statement is at an end. So there we are. We've spread this over several lines and we've finished it with a semicolon. So to assign a value to a variable, use the equals sign. Put the variable on the left and the value on the right. Numbers don't need to be in quotes, but strings or text must be in matching quotes. I follow the recommended practice to use single quotes unless the string contains apostrophes. Then I use double quotes to avoid the need to escape the apostrophe with a backslash. So far, we've assigned values to 5 variables. The next stage is to display them in our web page.